Hello, my name is Victoria, and this video is about some basic watercolor techniques and skills. I teach watercolor classes over Zoom, and if you want to learn more about those, there will be my website in the description of this video. Here are some basic skills that we use every time we do watercolor painting. So I'm sure that you've heard of wet on wet versus wet on dry, and I'm going to show the differences between them. The main difference, well, really the only difference, is wet on wet means getting the paper wet with water first before doing the pigment. So I'm using Winsor & Newton watercolor paints. They are professional watercolor paints. They're very good. They are my favorite brand. I will make a video talking about different supplies. And I have my paper wet. You can see it with the glare there. And I'm just going to use some alizarin crimson here. And I do have the paint on my brush. If I barely even touch it to the paper, we get pigment right there. So the water is helping move the pigment around. We don't need to do too much work, just a little bit. And I can even go over that a second time, just hit this up a little more, make it a little darker. Okay. And then wet on dry, so I'm not going to get the paper wet first. It already goes on darker because there's less water, so the pigment moves around less. I have to put in some more work to get this to be moved around, but this has more control than the wet on wet does. They both have their value, and in fact, I would say that I use both techniques equally. We're going to let that dry for a moment. We're going to move on up to this value scale. So what is that? Let's go with some green. That's a good one. Now this green color I'm going to use, this is Perylene green. It's pretty dark. So I'm doing this wet on dry, as we just saw. And the more down I go, the less paint there is. Now I can go all the way down to the end of this paper and still probably have some paint on my brush, so I'm just going to bring a little bit of water into this. There we go. It's good to do these with new colors, especially to see their different values that they get. Now I can even make it go darker. It will only be as dark as it is from the tube without adding black. So that is the darkest it will be without adding black. So that's pretty dark, but I have this whole range of in-between colors here. Now, this paper that I'm using is actually Canson paper. It's okay. My favorite paper is Arches, but this was just a little demo sheet. So you can do this with all of your paints, and in fact, when you shop for paint, even online, here's just a little brochure that I have for some Daniel Smith. They often do little color swatches like that so that you can see the way that they have for the value scale. So let's get over here. They have a lot of colors actually. Like right here, this is a good example. You can see it goes from dark to light. That's what I've just done there. And I do make and label my own little ones so that I know all of the paint that I have. I find it very helpful. Okay, So let's check back on our wet on wet versus wet on dry. Now, just a little hint, a little tip. Watercolor always dries 10% lighter than it looks like when it's wet. So this one particularly looked much darker just a few minutes ago. Now they're pretty much the same, maybe just a little bit darker on this. So just kind of keep that in mind, and that's why a lot of times we do have to go back and go over areas again. Now a wash, I'm just going to fill this square here with paint. So I'm actually going to do the wet on wet technique. I find it works easier when you are doing washes. I mean, it's in the word itself. We're going to get this whole square wet. And if you're doing a big area, you just have to work fast. So I do like having some bigger brushes on hand for big areas like that. But this is a pretty small area, so this will be fairly easy. And let's do some blue. I've got some Prussian blue here. And so I want this to be all one tone. So really, this is what I just did when I did wet on wet, but I am doing it to fit a square. I did go out of the square just a little bit, but that's all right. And sometimes it helps to have some boundaries. Okay, a 2-color wash. I'm just going to get this whole thing wet. Whoops, I've got a little bit of blue left over, but that's okay. And I'm actually going to pick some complementary colors. Let's do red and green. We'll start up here with our red. It's about halfway. And then I'm going to dig right into the green. You can see I'm getting some blooms there, but that's okay. And I did want them to blend a little bit in the middle, not too much because I don't want to make brown. Maybe a little too dark with that. Let's scrub some of that out. There we go. It just lifts it right up. Okay, I think that looks fine. And we can just really quickly next to this little value scale talk about gravity. Now, I'm painting on a flat surface, so there's not too much that I'm concerned about here. If I was painting on an easel, I'd be working against gravity. Now, I do want these to dry just a little bit more before I do go for what I'm going to do. But while they're drying, I can talk about, so I have blooms written down here, but I do see that some are happening. This is not just a one color wash. This seemed to be a little bit better than a one. I know there is 2 colors there, but that's okay. These things happen. Got a bloom, not going to worry about it. In fact, I can come back over this. Give it a little scrub. I am disturbing the pigment. Now this is just clean water. Oops, I went outside of the square. It's all right. Now part of my struggle here is that I'm not using the Arches paper, but I did have this Canson paper lying around, so I just wanted to get some use out of it. Let's come back in. I'm just going to make it a little bit darker, and this should dry a little more evenly. Now again, it's not the worst thing in the world to have some blooms. Some people like them, some people don't. I just wanted a one tone wash though, so I want this all to be one color. I don't want there to be lighter bits. I don't want there to be darker bits. Okay, that should dry a little bit better. And I don't mind showing when something doesn't exactly go the way you plan, because I think it's helpful in teaching, because there are times where I do a wash and I look and that happens, so I have to go back over it and fix it. Surprisingly, this one just worked out better. It's how it goes. I don't want to lift this up just yet, so I'm going to deviate from that plan of showing how gravity gets involved, just because I want that to dry flat. So let's come down here to talk about blooms. I've got some purple, so I'm doing this wet on dry because I find it easier to get blooms when you're doing something wet on dry. So what are blooms? Blooms are when you have the pigment not staying completely as a one color wash. So far, this top one that we just fixed is doing much better. I have water come in and disturb it. So especially just as it's drying. So I'm just dropping clean water in here. Maybe let's drop a little bit more. Ooh, there we go. I don't want to do too much. It kind of looks like an amoeba, this one. Let's see. Yep, we can see what's happening. You can see it is pushing the pigment. The water is pushing the pigment as it's moving. And actually, here's a good time to talk about gravity. You can see that I'm controlling the water with how I'm moving my paper. Now, this top one that doesn't have as much water on it anymore isn't too affected, but we're going to let that be. So people do this on purpose, but sometimes you don't want them. And so like you saw me do up here, I just come back over those areas with a little bit more paint, and it usually is fine. Now, pigment to water ratio. How much water you have on your brush to how much pigment you have on your brush. The more water and less pigment, the lighter your color is going to be, and the more pigment, the darker. So that's why the value scales are helpful and nice to do. Let's pick let's pick some pink. That's generally a nice light color. So this pink right here, that's pretty light. It's kind of a blushy color. I barely touched in my palette that area. I took it really from here, and I know that my palette is kind of crazy looking, but if I really dig with my brush, really dig and get that color on here, look how much darker. It's the same color, but there is more pigment on my brush and less water because I did this wet on dry. So that is looking good, and even the bloomy bit is starting to look really nice. I am going to show you how to fix them to get them to look a little bit lessened. I do have maybe just a teensy bit of some blooms going on up there, but mostly this is one color, and I'm happy with that. And really, this in the middle did not mix all that much. So let us just do another little value scale here. Let's go with a dark color. This is some neutral tint by Winsor Newton. And it's nice to have just a sheet like this that you can play around with. You don't need to do anything representational, just kind of get a feel for the medium. If I hold this, you can see the paint is moving. Now that's not a bad thing if I want it to do that. And it's starting to pool at the bottom there. And that's actually a pretty decent way to get a nice wash. Now I did this first one while it was just lying flat on the table, but that is almost one tone of a wash. And I could go the opposite way. I can make that water come back up if I wanted to. So using gravity can be quite advantageous. And I really quickly, while this part is still drying, also would like to talk about just supplies really quick. Again, I have another video that I have made that goes a little more detailed into supplies, but I've got my Winsor Newton paints that I really enjoy. They are the Professional Watercolor, and the Arches hot press paper. So what is hot press? Hot press is very smooth paper. Cold press is more of the general watercolor paper that we see. A lot of people use cold press, but I like hot press. You can see how smooth this is. It's very smooth. And I'm using it on what's called a block. So a block is just a whole bunch of paper that is glued together on the sides there and then separated, and you can just separate them as you paint. Now you paint with them on the block, so you can only use one piece of paper at a time. And then this is just a sample of what cold press is. You can see how bumpy and textured that is there. So that is just a personal preference. I prefer the hot press paper. All right, so this is still kind of drying, but that's okay. We can just start. So let's pretend I was painting something and I come and I see, oh no, there's a big bloom. I don't want that. I'm going to take actually a smaller brush than what I was using because I don't want to introduce too much water. But I do know what color I used. I used this purple. And I'm just coming back over this area. Now I am having to make it a little bit darker. Just a little bit. And if you actually do get it while it's still wet, it is a little easier to take out and fix. So it's not a bad thing that I did this while it was still a little bit wet. But I am having to make it just a teensy bit darker. But that is almost no bloom detectable. Like really, truly, that is almost that quality. So it's not like mistakes can't be fixed. They totally, totally can be. And while we're still just talking about different techniques, I want to talk about scrubbing up. So let's just use our value scale here as an example. I'm going to turn this to make it a little easier. I'm coming in here with clean water on my brush, and then what I'm doing off screen is just dipping it into the clean water again and then dabbing it on a paper towel. So doing the same thing. Look at how much I was able to lift off of there. Now, it's never, never, never going to be the white of the paper, but that is so much better than it was even just a minute ago, if you went too dark. So that is an option that you have to come back into your work and do a little bit of a scrub. Another option, once again, is a magic eraser, Mr. Clean Magic Eraser. You just get it wet a little bit, and it's a very, very little piece that I have here, but it also is able to lift up some pigment. The Arches paper that I really was talking about that I like to use, that paper can really take some some doing to it. It can kind of take, I always like to say it can take a beating. You can't really rip it that easily. With other cheaper papers, you can rip it easily. So that's why it is very important to use good supplies. And I hope that this was just a helpful little quick introduction to the different techniques of watercolor. And let me know if you have any questions. Thank you so much for watching.